What does the landscape look like now when we think about the regulation of procurement at a local government level? And this is really what we're talking about. So we've got right at the top, of course, the Constitution, which we know primarily in Section 217 tells us a lot about procurement. For local government, I think it is particularly important to remember that it's not just Section 217 of the Constitution that is of critical importance. I think that there are many other sections in the Constitution, especially with local government, that we often neglect when we talk about SCM and the Constitution and local government. So I think it's important to bear all of those in mind, because in the local government context, especially the service delivery mandate that comes directly from the Constitution is very much implicated when we talk about procurement. So I think it's very important for all of us to remember that alongside 217, there are a host of other really important constitutional provisions that would also be implicated in SCM at a local government level. But then if we talk a little bit more specifically, we've got then directly under the Constitution, the Municipal Finance Management Act, which has got in Chapter 11 quite a bit of detailed rules on SCM. And those are then further fleshed out in the Municipal Supply Chain Management Regulations, which are made in pursuance of Chapter 11 in the MFMA. And again, a lot of detail in the Municipal Supply Chain Management Regulations. They are probably our most detailed hard procurement rules we've got in the South African procurement system. They, however, only inform, for the most part, the SCM policy, and the SCM policy informs procurement decisions on the ground, right? So that's the main kind of line of rules in local government procurement as we know it at the moment, the kind of scheme. Alongside the MFMA, we then also, of course, have the PPPFA, the Preferential Procurement Policy Framework Act, which gives us another side of the procurement story. We're all very familiar with it, and we know that we always read the PPPFA with the MFMA. They're a package. They always work together. Under the PPPFA, we've got the preferential regulations, which we've got a brand new set now, the 2022 regulations, and they also just inform the SCM policy, or at least the preferential procurement policy that typically forms part of the SCM policy, which in turn informs your procurement decisions. Now, within that MFMA PPPFA space, we've also got a whole host of other secondary kind of instruments, typically called circulars, and they are weird and wonderful in the sense that they're created under any or all of these regulatory instruments. Sometimes it's quite difficult to figure out whether they're actually now created under the MFMA as opposed to the Municipal Supply Chain Management Regulations. Be that as it may, they all influence your SCM policy at local government level, but very importantly, this is an important point to note for our purposes today, is that as things currently stand, circulars in local government context are not binding per se. That means that when they're issued, typically by National Treasury, they are not automatically binding on local government. They just guide, they give advice, they give guidance on how all these other instruments are meant to be interpreted and are meant to inform your SCM policy, but they're not binding, they're not law. And then finally, the third major leg, and let me say, I'm just talking about the major instruments. There's, of course, a whole host of more specific, detailed other instruments alongside this main story. But then the third main actor in the story is the construction sector under the CIDB Act, the Construction Industry Development Board Act, which governs all construction procurement, which, of course, at local government level is also highly relevant. Under the CIDB Act, the CIDB has created a whole host of instrument standards and all kinds of different mechanisms, and they also inform your SCM policy, then specifically relating to construction or infrastructure procurement. One of the most important aspects of this picture in our current alignment of regulatory powers, which is distinct from all other levels of procurement in South Africa at the moment, is the fact that the council at local government level sits between this entire regulatory regime created in, either parliament or by way of regulation and the specific municipalities' SCM policy. So Our current regime is one where the council acts as the absolute filter for the specific rules applied at local government level. So what does this mean in practice? It means that whatever is issued at any level must go through the council to, in the end, become binding rules at that specific municipality's procurement function. And this is well illustrated, for example, with reference to these circulars or whatever other instruments are issued under these statutes, that they can only really become binding if the council adopts them. But the council at the moment has got the power to just say, no, we're not going to adopt this particular circular for whatever reason. And then it's not binding. And this is a distinct feature of procurement regulation at local government level. It's very different at the other levels. So if you think about more or less the equivalent of the council at other levels of government, then we can, for example, say that the MECs, the provincial executive, or the cabinet at national level, the ministers, got no power to prescribe the SCM policy of a department. The National Treasury simply prescribes it, and then the department is bound by an instruction, for example. So it's very different at local government level. So what will happen now with the reform that we're seeing is that the Public Procurement Act will replace that entire MFMA and triple PFA regime. It will just come and sit in the place of what we've got, but not the CIDB regime. The CIDB regime will remain. So the picture that will emerge following this reform as it is currently proposed will look like this. We will have directly under the Constitution the Public Procurement Act. Under the Act, there will be issued regulations as well as instructions, binding instructions. And those instructions can be issued by either this newly created body called the Public Procurement Office, which is basically the current OCPO with a different name, as well as provincial treasuries. And they've both got the power to issue directly binding instructions in SCM. And those regulations alongside these instructions will dictate the SCM policy, which will then determine the procurement decisions. It is the same picture for the entire South African state. So no longer will there be any differentiation between local government and the other levels of government. It will be a single regulatory regime. And very importantly, council will have no role to play whatsoever. It is probably the biggest shift in regulatory power proposed by this regime, and that is to take council, local government councils, completely out of the picture.